Hello everybody, it's Michelle from Lab Muffin Beauty Science here. You might have seen the news that Hawaii has banned some sunscreens that have been linked to coral bleaching. The two banned ingredients are the organic or so-called chemical sunscreens, oxybenzone and octinoxate. Are these ingredients that bad? Should you avoid them at the beach? Should you avoid them in your daily sunscreens? Is the ban supported by the science? That's what we're talking about today, the science behind sunscreen and coral. One of the main issues facing coral is bleaching, and that's the main harmful effect that's been linked to some sunscreens. Coral bleaching happens when the coral turns white. The stuff that makes coral coloured are microscopic algae called zooxanthellae. These algae and coral live in a symbiotic relationship. It's a beneficial live-in partnership. The algae live inside the coral and they play an important role. They absorb light from the sun and photosynthesize, and the nutrients that they create provide the coral with about 90% of its energy. But when the coral gets stressed, that's when bleaching happens. The algae leave the coral, leaving the coral white and bleached. Without the algae, the coral don't have their main source of food, and so they'll slowly starve to death. Bleaching can be reversible. If the stress goes away, then the algae can go back to the coral and everything is okay again. But if there's too much stress, or if the stress goes on for too long, then the coral stays bleached and eventually it dies. There are lots of different stresses that can cause coral bleaching. The main ones are temperature changes, particularly the higher temperatures that are associated with global warming from climate change. There's also ocean acidification, when the pH of the ocean drops because there's too much carbon dioxide. Again, this is related to climate change. There might also be increased visible and UV light from the sun, and also if there's too much pollution, for example herbicides, fertilizers from farming, oil spills and dirt. Relatively recently, it's been discovered that some sunscreen ingredients can also cause bleaching. The studies were conducted on isolated coral. Pieces of coral were placed in a bag, and the sunscreen ingredients were added to them. Here are some of the studies. Danavaro and co-workers found that hard corals were bleached by oxybenzone, octinoxate, which is also called octyl-methoxycinnamate or ethylhexyl methoxycinnamate, and enzacamine, which is also known as 4-methylbenzylidene camphor, or 4-MBC. They also tested some other sunscreen ingredients and found that they didn't cause any bleaching. These sunscreens were octocrylene, octosalate or octylsalicylate, and avobenzone. A 2014 study found that titanium dioxide nanoparticles could also cause slight bleaching. A 2016 study from the Hereticus laboratory by Downs and co-workers found that oxybenzone causes bleaching and deformities in multiple coral species. A 2017 study by Fell and co-workers at L'Oreal found that octocrylene, octyltrizone, ecamphsyl or Mexoryl SX, and drometrazole trisiloxane or Mexoryl XL had no effect on coral, while avobenzone only had an effect at a very high concentration. Zinc oxide caused bleaching in this study. In 2018, a study by Corinal Desi and co-workers found that uncoated zinc oxide nanoparticles cause rapid bleaching, while modified titanium dioxide nanoparticles had a minimal effect. I've put more details about each of these studies in the blog post that I have linked to this video, and the links to each of the studies are in there as well. It's in the caption. Now, these studies sound pretty worrying, especially since the bleaching happened even with really low concentrations of sunscreen ingredients. We're talking parts per million and parts per billion concentrations. But the amounts of sunscreen in the ocean are also really low. So one of the key questions we should be asking is there enough sunscreen in the environment to harm coral? First off, we're going to have to talk more about these extremely low concentrations. There's extremely low, and then there's extremely, extremely low. Here are some of the numbers involved. ppm means parts per million, or milligrams per litre. This is the equivalent of about 1/50th of a drop diluted in 1 litre, which is about a quarter gallon for you US people. It's about this much. ppb means parts per billion, or micrograms per litre. 1 ppb is 1,000 times more dilute than 1 ppm. ppt means parts per trillion, or nanograms per litre. 1 ppt is 1,000 times more dilute than 1 ppb, and 1,000,000 times more dilute than 1 ppm. A fundamental principle in toxicology, or the science of how bad stuff is that the dose makes the poison. The long version of this is that everything can be a poison in large enough amounts, and everything is safe in low enough amounts. ppm, ppb, and ppt are all extremely low and tiny to us, but the difference between ppm and ppt is 1 million. So to go from 1 ppm to 1 ppt, you take your litre with 1/50th of a drop and throw it into half of an Olympic swimming pool. This massive difference is really important when we're looking at the amounts of sunscreen in the environment. Are the concentrations low enough to be safe? Or are they high enough to be harmful? In these studies, the coral was exposed to sunscreen in the parts per million and parts per billion range. And while these sound really low, other coral researchers have pointed out that these concentrations are actually much higher than the amounts of sunscreen that you find in the vast majority of the environment. For example, the lowest concentration of pure sunscreen filter used in the 2008 Danovero paper that had an effect was about 1 part per million of enzocamine, or 4 MBC. 1 part per million sounds really small, but if you think about it, it actually turns out to be quite a lot. If you apply 30 grams of sunscreen, which is the recommended amount for an adult-sized body, and it had 3% enzocamine in it, and all of it washed off your body into the water, to get 1 part per million, you'd be swimming in about 900 litres of water, which is only about 3 bathtubs full. To get 2.28 parts per billion of oxybenzone, one of the lowest amounts tested in the 2016 Down study, your 30 grams of sunscreen containing 6% oxybenzone would have to completely wash off in 790,000 litres of water, or about 1/3 of an Olympic swimming pool. These estimates are actually on the high side, since studies have found that people usually wear less than half the recommended amount of sunscreen, and the amount that dissolves in water is a lot less than 100%. One study estimated that only about 1/4 of your sunscreen washes off during a 20-minute swim. The ocean is also incredibly massive. Ridiculously, unimaginably, mind-blowingly massive. It contains about 97% of the world's water, which is 1.34 times 10 to the 21 litres. That's about 200 times more litres than there are grains of sand in the world. It's 70,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools for each of the 7.44 billion people living on Earth. There are also ocean currents that mix this water around, so it shouldn't be surprising that sunscreen is only found in almost undetectable concentrations in most of the environment. That's in the ppt range. And a lot of the time, it can't actually be detected. But in some situations, in some environments, there could be higher concentrations of sunscreen that could realistically affect coral. Generally, this is in the more enclosed bays in areas with lots of tourists, where there might be hundreds of sunscreen-covered people swimming in a small area of water. For example, there's been high concentrations of oxybenzone measured near popular beaches in the US Virgin Islands. At Hawks Nest Bay and Trunk Bay, 75 parts per billion and 1.4 parts per million of oxybenzone have been measured during busy times of the day. There's also a possibility that even though the amounts in water are low, bioaccumulation might happen. This is when the coral takes in and collects the sunscreen ingredients, so they build up and form a much higher concentration inside the coral. So there are only really low concentrations in the environment, although in some places they might be higher. But there's another big question mark in the data. There isn't any solid evidence of sunscreens having caused harm to coral reefs yet. Some researchers have mentioned that they've seen that coral reefs in a few areas with more swimmers are more degraded than in areas with less swimmers, or they're worse in areas with more sunscreen use. But this is anecdotal evidence at the moment, so it isn't really convincing. There could be other factors at play, so for example the tourists might trample on the coral reefs. So all the headlines that you might have read, that sunscreen kills coral reefs, oxybenzone causes major damage to coral reefs, the sunscreen ban will save coral reefs, this isn't what the studies say. Some scientists have tried to estimate the amount of damage that sunscreens might cause to coral. In aquatic recreational areas in Hong Kong near snorkeling hotspots, it's been estimated that the risk of bleaching by oxybenzone is 21% and the risk of bleaching by octinoxate is 11%. A 2008 study estimated that 10% of the world's reefs are threatened by sunscreen pollution, and this number's been cited in a bunch of other papers. This sounds pretty concerning, but marine scientists who research the wider causes of coral reef damage say not so fast. A lot of marine scientists are actually pretty critical of the sunscreen ban. If we zoom out and look at the wider picture, it turns out that the possible harm from sunscreens is really tiny. In recent textbooks and reviews on coral bleaching, sunscreens don't even rate a mention. Instead, there's tons and tons of data showing that climate change and agricultural management have wreaked havoc on coral reefs and will continue to do so. Professor Terry Hughes, a massively respected coral expert and the director of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies, says he would put sunscreen all the way down at number 200 on a list of bad things that humans can do to coral reefs. He points out that the worst coral bleaching is happening in areas where tourists don't go. So for example, in the massive 2016 Great Barrier Reef bleaching event, the worst bleaching by far happened in the remote northern region, and the severe bleaching patterns matched the areas with higher water temperatures caused by climate change. Researchers Kelvin Gorospe and Austin Humphreys at the University of Rhode Island also say that the damage from sunscreen is negligible when you look at how climate change threatens coral reefs. They say that if you want to do something to save the reefs in the ocean, you shouldn't be worrying about sunscreen. Banning sunscreens to try to save coral reefs is a bit like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic or polishing a scratch on your doorknob when your house is burning down. Yes, technically every little bit helps. But is it worth spending time and effort and resources dealing with sunscreen when there are much bigger issues to work on? And many of these scientists think that it's actually a bit of a sneaky trick by politicians to hype up this sunscreen issue. It's an easy way for them to show us that they're doing something, while distracting us from the real issues, climate change and agricultural management, which are much harder to fix, and something that their corporate donors probably don't want them to fix, because it cuts into their profits. So they encourage us to think that sunscreens are a much bigger issue than they actually are, so that we might get off their backs. And ironically, if you're throwing out unused sunscreens and driving around looking for the right sunscreens with the right ingredients, you're actually making the climate change problem worse. Okay, so what can we actually do to help the reefs? Firstly, in terms of sunscreen, you don't really need to do much, except when you're planning to swim in an area close to coral. If that's the case, you should try to use more sun protective clothing and stay in the shade more, so that you can use a bit less sunscreen. For the bits of your skin that are still exposed, you should look for sunscreens that don't have ingredients that have been found to be harmful to coral. The common sunscreen ingredients that have been found to be harmful are oxybenzone, octinoxate, enzacamine or 4-MBC, and zinc oxide. The common sunscreen ingredients that have been found to cause minimal harm or no harm at all are octocrylene, octosalate, avobenzone, octotrizone, ecamshal or mexoryl SX, drometrazole trisiloxane or mexoryl XL, and titanium dioxide. The sunscreen ingredients that haven't been tested on coral yet are bimotrizonol or tinosorb S, bisoxtrazole or tinosorb M, DHHB or uvinyl A+, and sulizole and homosalate. There are lots of brands that have coral-safe sunscreens in their range, even if they don't say coral-safe. So for example, Supergoop, La Roche-Posay, Sunsense, Stream to Sea, Coppertone, and Headhunter. It's important that you actually check the ingredients of the sunscreen, and don't just look for labels that say reef-friendly or biodegradable. These terms aren't regulated, so they don't necessarily mean anything. So there's a lot of sunscreens that say they're reef-friendly, but might contain oxybenzone. A lot of sunscreen brands also assume that all organic or chemical sunscreens are harmful, while all inorganic or mineral sunscreens are safe, even though zinc oxide has been found to be worse for coral than many chemical sunscreens. I talk a little bit more about why I think that it's not just nanoparticle zinc oxide that harms coral in my blog post, so check that out if you're interested in the nerdy nitty-gritty. Biodegradable also doesn't mean reef-safe. Both zinc oxide and titanium dioxide are non-biodegradable, since living organisms can't break them down. But zinc oxide has been found to be harmful to coral in some studies, while titanium dioxide has been relatively safe. You should try to limit how much sunscreen comes off your body into the water as well. Look for a highly water-resistant sunscreen and apply your sunscreen 20 minutes before you go into the water, so it has a chance to dry down and stick to your skin better. The other big thing we should all be doing for coral and for the rest of the environment is to do something about climate change. Climate change is a huge and scary problem, but there are some things that we can all do to help. We can try to cut down on our biggest contributors to our own carbon footprints. For most people, this is owning and driving a car, going on long flights, and eating meat. You can also switch to an energy company that uses green energy. You can also vote for political parties who firstly recognize that climate change is a problem and who have policies that actually tackle climate change. And you can contact your local representatives about climate change. If you feel like your voice isn't that important and you're just one small person, it might make you feel better to know that because most people don't contact them. They assume that for every one person who does contact, there are 10 or 20 silent people who feel the same way. And that's all for today. Sorry that was a bit of a depressing video, but the politics around climate change are pretty depressing. My next video is going to be a lot more cheerful. I've put the link to the blog post for this video with all the info and links to the studies and further reading and everything in the caption. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel. You can also find out more about the science behind skincare and other beauty products on my blog, and you can follow me on Facebook and Instagram as well. See you next time for more beauty science.